let's talk about exceptions. To demonstrate what they are and what you can do with them, I have prepared a small main file with a few static functions. Our main method calls the layer 1 method, which then calls the layer 2 method, which then calls the layer 3 method. And if we run our program as it is currently, you can see that our console prints layer 3, layer 2, and layer 1 accordingly, even though we're actually calling the methods in the reverse of the order of that. That is because whenever we call the layer 1 method, it instantly calls layer 2 before it gets to the system print line, and only after the layer 2 method is finished, it goes back and finishes executing our layer 1 method. So that's what's causing this effect. So now let's talk about exceptions. An exception is basically like an error. So something wrong went with your code, something didn't work out, and your method has to throw an exception for your program to continue functioning normally. There are many different kinds of exceptions, although I will be just using the regular exception type. There are many other subclasses of exception, and you can also make your own subclasses of exception. So basically you can make your own custom named errors. And separately from exceptions, there is an actual error class. The difference is that when you're throwing an exception, your program can still be salvaged. It's like a small error which you can catch somewhere and you can deal with it. But errors are used in case something happens that should have never happened, and you shouldn't even bother catching it, because if the error happened, that just means your whole program is not working properly. So how do you throw an exception? Let's go to our layer 3 method, and after our system print, to throw an exception, we're gonna type throw new exception, and then in the constructor, let's give it a string saying layer 3 had an issue, end it with a semicolon, and that would be how you throw an exception. But now that you're actually throwing it, you have to do one of two things. The first option is you have to declare that your method is throwing an exception, so that every method that's calling it, or every place that's calling it, is notified that the thing they're calling can be throwing an exception and can result in issues, or you can try and catch that exception. For our three methods, let's just try declaring that they all throw an exception. Let's start with layer 3 because that's where we actually create our new exception. Public static void layer 3 throws exception. And now you can see our function call in layer 2 says unhandled exception type exception. So again, we can either catch it or we can throw it further. So let's keep going. Layer 2 throws exception, layer 1 throws exception, and now we're back in our main function. But there's one more important thing to remember, and that is if you're actually throwing that exception further and you're not catching it, that action then instantly ends the method and doesn't let it continue forward, which I can demonstrate in a second. But first, I'll actually show you how to catch an exception so that your program doesn't end. In the current scenario, if I run the program, you can see that the program just ends because of an unhandled exception. So let's go over here and let's type in try. In the try statement, we put our method call. And then after our try bracket, we type in catch, open another bracket. And after the catch keyword, actually, you have to specify what are you catching exactly. We're catching just an exception type exception. So in the bracket, we're going to catch exception, and let's just call it E. And finally, in our curly brackets, we can do different things with our exception. Since exceptions are objects like everything else, we can type in E dot, and then we can see a bunch of operations which can be done on exceptions. We simply want to get message, and let's put it in system printout, system print line e.getMessage, and we've got our exception. So now let's run a program and see what happens. As you can see, like we expected, it prints layer 3 had an issue because that's the exception we threw at our layer 3, and that's what we printed out when we caught our exception. However, you can also see that not all messages have been printed, but only layer 3 did. And that's because, like I mentioned before, if you throw an exception, it ends your method instantly. So if our layer 3 method throws the exception, it goes back to what called it, which means it goes back here to layer 2. And because there is no try and catch statement, we're not catching the exception. Instead of going to the next line and printing layer 2, it instantly throws that exception further, going back to layer 1. This one doesn't catch it either, so it ends that method again, and it goes back to main, where it's actually being caught and the message from it is being printed. There are many different types of exceptions. I just used the general type, which is usually subclassed by other things. If you would like to use a more specific exception or a different type of exception, you would just replace the word exception everywhere with the name of the class which you're using. So let's just say our exception class is called brick. You would type in throw new brick, layer 3 throws brick, layer 2 throws brick, and then our catch statement, you would type in brick e or whatever other name for the parameter which you want. And that would be it for exceptions. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in for the next time.